Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. And in particular, I would like to thank my colleagues, Professor Mierzejewski, Jura, and Kowalski, and particular Professor Kowalski, because he's actually ill today, so I'm sorry to talk about that. Well, we are going to have a seminar on China's behavior in the Global South. We are going to organize this seminar like this. First, we will make a presentation, maybe, I don't know, total 45, 50 minutes. I don't know, let's see how it goes. Then you are encouraged actually, to ask questions and to raise any issues you may have on this. Okay, so we can have like an active Q&A. I'm not going to introduce neither the projects or these guys because Dominik, he's going to do it himself. So yeah, let's begin. Go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Right. Mario, thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here in Madrid. It's at least my first time in Madrid, so I enjoyed the city yesterday, and we enjoy watching the match. So let me start with a short introduction of the group people. You know Mario. I will not introduce you, I'm sorry. But on my left side, I have Jarek, who is a leading scholar in Poland on China-Africa studies. He developed his knowledge for more than 15 years in Africa. Previously, he studied in China, so he also possesses quite a fluent command in Chinese. He also published a bit on China-Africa from analysis of sentiments, media appearances of China in mainly Angola and Zambia. And in this project, he's responsible for China-Kenya and China-South Africa relations. Then we have Bartek, who is a rising star in Poland on China, Central Europe relations, also studied in China, did quite a work on China, Central Europe relations, mainly from the relationality perspective. And recently he published a book on China, Czech Republic relations from this framework approach. And in the project, he's responsible for the relationship between China and Serbia and China and Poland. Mario is responsible here on China-Chile and China-Brazil relations, and me, myself, I'm Dominik. I'm working on China for 25 years, both as a student and now as a scholar. In a project, I'm focusing on China-Thailand and China-Cambodia relations. So that's a very short introduction. Let us begin. So we have outline here, as you see, and we will proceed as follows. That the first part will be I will introduce the project, and so you will have better understanding of the rationale behind our research, supported by the National Science Center in Poland. Then we will go to Latin America, Africa, let me check here, Central Europe, and I will end with Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and conclusions. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the kind of the basic rationale behind our research is that we're trying to identify, or we identified, in fact, three basic mechanisms in China's relations with developing countries under the framework of China-led multilateralism. And to a certain degree, BRI umbrella, but BRI, we know, from our perspective, at least, I can tell you that it's like a slogan-like thing, not a strategy, not geopolitical strategy, but we can have the discussion later on. So we identified these three mechanisms, and the first is narrative, slogan, politics, discursive power. So in other words, we try to understand what kind of messaging is selling by China towards different audiences. And from this perspective, we try to see that China is learning by doing, but also is diversifying the Chinese messaging towards different actors. Then we go with elite diplomacy, social networks. So in each of countries I mentioned, we did interviews, and we tried to identify what are the core of China's elite diplomacy in the selected countries. And finally, we're debating economic statecraft, trade, projects, and tech cooperation from the bilateral level. When it comes to methodology, I think this is quite important, and I will not call it unique, but to a certain degree, it's a very fresh approach to China Global South relationship. That's comparative study. We use mixed method with application of software, OrdStat and MaxQDA, supported by the in-depth interviews in selected countries. So altogether, we spend like a week, like in Serbia, due to geographical proximity, but also in Latin America, almost 3 weeks, traveling through Chile and Brazil to São Paulo and Brasilia. So that's about methodology. Going deeper to our methodological issues, you need to acknowledge that we discuss this discursive power in multilateral formats. So China, Latin America, China, Africa, China, Central Europe, China, ASEAN, with 3 main categories. That is historical references, China model, areas for cooperation, and altogether we identified more than 900 categories, subcategories. And we did this through keyword in context qualitative analysis. Then when it comes to networks, we present a very general overview of China's approaching elites in the selected countries. But then we made a qualitative and quantitative analysis of China's networks, particularly through embassies activities during COVID-19. So from this perspective, this project is kind of a unique that presents a different tactics applied by the Chinese diplomacy in countries like Thailand, you see, Cambodia, Kenya, South Africa, Poland, Serbia, Brazil, and Chile. And when it comes to economic engagements, we identify the major, let's say, categories. Trade, as I mentioned before, projects, and tech cooperation, also from the comparative approach. So we see which countries are more receptive, for example, like in case of media. That's, I think, pretty relevant to see this. And finally, I need to introduce the justification of case studies. We use fragile state index. There are some categories: stable, fragile, warning status of countries in selected multilateral formats, plus relations with the United States. So if you just see Poland and Serbia in Europe, we have close relations as Poles with Americans, like Serbia is not very much in favor of having Americans there because of some historical reasons, 1999, and so on and so forth. So now I will give the floor to Mario.
Or maybe, Dominik, if I may, just to save us a little bit of work for Bartek, because maybe some of them, they are wondering why, in a topic related with the Global South, there are like some European countries included, because we all know, but maybe they don't know. So probably, they might be wondering now.
Yeah, sure. For many of you, this designation for Poland, and generally speaking for Central and Eastern European as a part of Global South, might be surprising. However, this comes from a very deep-seated assumptions about Central and Eastern Europe in China. This goes back to the 19th century, when countries of Central and Eastern Europe were seen as a country in demise. For example, Poland was partitioned by 3 empires. And because the second thing is that the Chinese perception of this region in 19th century were built on the foreign sources, and these foreign sources were mostly Western European sources, which constructed an idea of Central and Eastern Europe as something less culturally advanced, less civilizationally advanced, less politically advanced part of Europe. And for this reason, China continued to see this region as a part of its South-South global agenda, right? And why it matters? It matters because China used specific financial and political approach towards developing countries. And because we were put in this basket of developing countries, we are also witnessing these policies, which are mostly unsuited for the region, because most of these countries are EU countries, NATO countries, apart from Western Balkans, including Serbia, of course. But this created lots of confusion in recent 10 or 15 years, and hopefully we will try to answer these questions, why it is so confusing and to large extent ineffective when it comes to Chinese benefits from pursuing such policy.
Okay, thank you. Now, so shall I begin with Latin America? Okay, so as Dominik mentioned before, we are going to focus first on narratives. I mean, how Chinese official narratives towards the regions, are elaborated, the content, how do they push those narratives in these different regions. We are only highlighting some specificities, regional specificities of that narratives. We don't have the time for being comprehensive. We have done much more work, with much more details, but we are only just highlighting, some things that are of particular relevance, when it comes to these different regions. So when it comes to Latin America, it's quite interesting that there is an invention of a common path between China and the region. They put emphasis, on historical, traditional, old times kind of relationships, which most of them actually does not exist. They are invented. But the funny part is that, well, funny or I think is interesting, is that when they do exist, it's mainly mediated by extra-regional powers, in particular Spain. I mean, you all know about this Galeón de Manila, right? So when Chinese narratives, they talk about these kind of exchanges, of course, they didn't mention, that those exchanges were mediated, by this extra-regional actor, So I think we think it's interesting, to put this on the table, because according to more general understanding of Chinese diplomacy of the world, we would relate those activities with colonialism, imperialism. So those kind of relationships should not be praised, by Chinese diplomacy, but they do praise those relationships because they don't mention, this intermediation by extra-regional actors. So it's also interesting that most of the time when Chinese diplomats explain the success of China, to socioeconomic success of China towards developing world audiences, most of the times they don't underline the relevance of socialism, right? The fact that China is a socialist country, and they have this kind of political and economic model. Most of the time they don't underline that. And it's not that they put a lot of emphasis on this, even when it comes to Latin America, but in comparative terms, they put much more emphasis on these concepts when they relate with Latin American audiences than when they relate to audiences for other parts of the global south. And this is probably because socialism, this kind of leftist kind of movements, and ideas, they have more attractive, they're more attractive in Latin America vis-a-vis, in Africa, or on Asia or whatever, So this is also relevant, that they emphasize a little bit more on socialism. But the key idea in their message, and this is always, we can find this, I think, in all the regions, is that relations with China are more beneficial, to the local countries, to these other developing world countries than relationships with the traditional powers. And they are more beneficial both at the economic and the political level. Okay, politically, because they're supposed to be relationships between equals, not vertical relationships, but horizontal relationships. And also because that kind of relationships are supposed to contribute to a more democratized international order, that from the perspective of China and of many of these developing world countries, the international order is to control, to monopolize, by traditional Western powers. So this kind of South-South relationship contribute to this democratization of the international order. And economically, because they present, economic interaction with China as breaking the traditional economic patterns of colonialism and imperialism. Remember, these are narratives, okay? We are not saying that the actual engagement of China in the regions abides to those narratives, okay? But they say, that that's how they present it, okay? This is important because later on we can discuss, the quite obvious differences between the narratives and the facts, When it comes, for example, for trade pattern, it's very obvious, the Chinese said that trade with China is not the traditional pattern of commodities and natural resources in return on industrial product, but actually it abides to that pattern. And in the narratives, Chinese authorities overemphasize investment in high technologies, investments, that could help the region to become more industrialized, more advanced, more sustainable, more green, whatever. But at the end of the day, very significant part of the financing or of the investment coming from China also goes to traditional economic sectors. Anyway, finally, related to narratives, this is the only single format. The China CELAC Forum is the only forum when they talk, about South-South cooperation. So this is also significant. Moving to network building, because this is not just about narratives, it's also about how different actors, put into practice, those narratives, how they actually build, the bilateral relations. Traditionally, during the Cold War, it's very obvious that Latin America was the region of the world in which the People's Republic of China had less influence. Russia, the Soviet Union at that time, make a big impact, but not that much, the PRC. So, when the Cold War ended, China has a much smaller footprint in Latin America than in Africa or in other parts of Asia. After the Cold War, and even a little bit later at the beginning of this 21st century, when economic relations started to be more important between China and the region, Chinese diplomacy started to build those relationships on those economic relations. They don't appeal anymore to common ideological, consensus, not that much anymore about anti-imperialism. There's a little bit of that, but not that much. So they started to cultivate, economic elites, and particularly in countries that is starting to have a stronger trade bond with China, stronger trade links with China, because China became the main trade partner, for many countries in the region. Paradoxically, well, not that paradoxical, but it's interesting to point out that many of the economic elites, having that kind of relationship, they were very conservative. They were not for the leftist parties, who were traditionally having this kind of relationship with China. So now these network buildings or these networks, Chinese aligned networks in Latin America, they don't have a very obvious or very clear ideological foundation. Many times it's more like this a business, or practical foundation. And it's not only about elites at the central government. You can find elites, as I said, in business, corporation, but also, in the local governments. And this is something maybe later we have the time we can explore a little bit. One obvious area in which China has not been very successful in cultivating Latin American elites is the military. Most of the militaries of the region, they have much closer relationship either with the US or with Russia. The US, because traditionally, they've had, during the Cold War, was very, very, very close, very intense in the countries that most of them were anti-communist, and nowadays also the countries that are more leftist, those countries actually, since they had also close relationship with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, now they have these agreements, the weapon sales, training, all these kind of activities with Russia, not that much with China. Right? China is not a very significant actor in the region when it comes to defense and security. Well, particularly in defense, security a little bit. When it comes to technological cooperation, Brazil is a very interesting case. It's an exception, because Brazil is a long time technological partner for China, since mid-1980s. They've been developing together, significant technological cooperation projects, for example, in satellite program, also civil aviation, so this is quite exceptional, But more general perspective, China presents and China is an attractive partner for the region in terms of diversification, of providers, for technology, and also in terms of investment and value for money, because Chinese technology tends to be relatively or comparatively cheaper, than technology coming from traditional powers. And also many times this kind of transactions, could have some financial, facility, some financial, support, sometimes. But in addition, it's important to underline that when it comes to technological cooperation, geopolitical concerns, particularly by the US, play a role. There is a pushback against this technological cooperation, as I said, mainly by the US. American diplomacy puts a lot of emphasis, a very high level, with Latin American countries to avoid intense engagement with China on the technological front. And we have, very significant examples of how US diplomatic pressure has prevented some of these projects actually to develop. In Chile, remember, these passports, there was this Chinese company who was supposed to print, the passports for the Chilean people and the ID, cards for the Chilean people. But US diplomacy threatens with retiring the visa, the electronic visa waiver, for Chile. So Chilean authorities, annulled that contract. Or a very famous also case was this submarine cable who was supposed to connect Chile with China, built by Huawei, but then, they decided to go for an alternative, going first to Australia and then to Japan. So this is something, that is significant. This technological cooperation is well beyond just an economic engagement. It has this geopolitical implication. And last remark from my side, despite all this hype about the BRI, in Latin America, all this talk about transoceanic corridors, channels and everything, actually not that much has happened. Now probably it's not a good time for saying this because, this last month, the port in Chancay, was inaugurated. But if you look, beyond that particular project, there are not that many, frankly speaking. We can maybe discuss a little bit more later on. But BRI is an obvious example in which there's a huge gap between narratives, expectations, and then, what's going on there. Actually, why not? Okay, so that's it for myself.
Now Africa.
Okay, so a few words about the Africa in the same frame, I would say. So first, narratives. The most important issues related to this. So first of all, there's in general, when we start this research, before in the documents we analyze, there are supposed to be quite plenty of the references to the historical aspects of cooperation. Actually, there were not so many. Although in case of the Africa, actually, I would say, let's say, the highest rate, still small, but the highest one. Why? First of all, I would say that the two types of the references which were considered to be a kind of the important wave of construction of these narratives. One is in general related. One is related to the post-colonial past. Actually, the common post-colonial past. So generally, they emphasize the idea that China has suffered during the colonization period. China was never colonized, but it was like, let's say, semi-colonized. So they're trying to emphasize that kind of the common suffering in the past, in the matter of the fact. So that's why, and also the fact that China helped officially trying to help African independence movements. What is interesting here, they rather emphasize that kind of the more, let's say, not so related with the supporting guerrillas part of this support, so the kind of more peaceful ones. Not mentioning too frequently this one when they supported some of those guerrillas. I think in general, order not to make these narratives a little bit more like controversial. Also, the problem was that they sometimes supported not the winning side, like in the Angola case, when Russians were supported the winning side. The same in the South Africa, where actually the Russians were supporting Mandela, not the Chinese. But anyway, the whole idea about having common post-colonial past, helping during the times of the of the fight for the independence, and also in the first years of the independence of the particular country. Here, the most notable example is Tazara, which is a kind of the railway built from Zambia to Tanzania to the port of Dar es Salaam, and they always emphasize this issue when the Mao helped Zambia to break through the blockade during the fight of independence. Second type of the framework related with the history, it was it's a little bit I would consider it a little bit even funny, because they quite often make the reference to the Asian common past, like the idea that we and Africa have a history of the Asian civilization. Yeah, so quite often I had the impression that actually they didn't know so much about this ancient African civilization, especially if you just take a look on the one example, which is a kind of the radicalism for me, when they present that idea to the Hammurabi Code, which was definitely not related with the African history, in the matter of the fact. So actually they refer to the Persian issue in the African context. So it means that actually, in the matter of the fact, they didn't know the full knowledge of what Africa is, but still they're trying to make the good impression. Another interesting issue in terms of the narratives is definitely related with this already it's a little bit similar to the Latin America, but I think in Africa it's even more important. The China want to present itself as a kind of the model country in Africa, especially in terms of of presenting their own model of the development, including introduction of the green transformation, new technologies, etc., etc. It is present in it's quite subtle way. So I mean, it's not like this that you are supposed to use our model, but rather we have managed to get out of the poverty. Our way of conduct is successful, so we can help you to develop as well, and you can maybe use our way, our model. What is interesting, and I will come back to this later on, that it's a little bit much more in the narratives again than in the reality. In this, let's say, transferring the new technologies to Africa, which is not necessarily only Africa, only Chinese fault. It's kind of the complicated process why nothing actually happened in terms of the development of economic development of Africa and technological development of Africa in the Chinese context. But I will come back to this. Yeah, and again, as I mentioned, quite strong emphasis of the industrialization similarly, which is also quite interesting because again, in the reality, there is not so much done in terms of the Chinese active role in the industrialization of Africa, but there are a lot of in the narratives. Of course, we do presume, and it's our interpretation, that in that way the Chinese mostly refer to the African expectations. So because African wants this, yeah. Another issue is that actually it is not happening in the reality in the most cases. Now if we change to the network building, so the situation in Africa I think is a little bit different to the Latin America. Of course, still, and that's I think the most common fact that the Chinese are focusing most on the relation with the elites. That's common, I would say, but a little bit different type of the elites. So. Not like in here I will focus mostly on our case studies, South Africa and Kenya, but in general I think it looks more or less similar in many other countries. So they rather focus on the relation or establishing relation of the political elites than business elites. Of course, the trade relations are also very important, but I would say there's not so high level of the trade dependence in case of the African countries, definitely not in case of the Kenya and South Africa, and in some other cases where trade is important, it's rather importing by Chinese the natural resources from African countries. So it's a little bit different issue, especially that this import is usually related with the loans, resources-backed loans system, but that's another story. So rather emphasis put on the relation with the political elites. in case of the Kenya and South Africa and both of those countries, I would say that they have been a kind of the historical tensions related with this. So it was not like this that during Cold War those relations were perfect. In case of the Kenya, actually, Kenyatta, the first Jomo Kenyatta, I would say just after the independence, the Zhou Enlai let's say, make a kind of the speech which was related with the supporting of the revolutionary movements in Africa, and concerning the fact that the first Kenyan government actually was maybe okay. I won't say it was right wing, but definitely not so left wing. So he was actually afraid of the Maoist revolution in Kenya. So it stopped those political relations for a certain point of time. Similarly, in South Africa, Mandela was rather supported by the Soviet Union, not by the China, and actual Chinese supported another also leftist movements, but not related with Nelson Mandela front. So those relations was again not very perfect. Mandela rather prefer Soviet Union than Russia. Although all this changed more or less after 2000s, when the China started much be engaged in economically, very strong economically in Africa, and then it was built mostly with relation to the economic. Although it was relation with the political, not economic rights, not business rights. Chinese are using in general in this network building with the political rights quite skillfully some methods of gaining the attention and positive relation with the African political allies. I would say the good example of this is something which happened, for example, in Kenya. When they built standard gauge railway, which was supposed to go primarily from Mombasa through whole Kenya, then to the Democratic Republic of Congo. The project stopped in certain part, but still there was a first idea. What is interesting that this project, a part of this project, I would say, was delivered just I think it was 2 or 3 months before the election in Kenya. So the idea was like this, that they were delivering the project close to the election cycle, and in that way they gain the relation with the local political alliance. Of course, it's not the only one example. There are, and a lot of examples of other ways of so-called, there's something which is called palace diplomacy and so on. So they delivering something in order to strengthen the position of the African political leaders, and this is quite skillful. On the other hand, which is quite interesting, they're quite skillful in terms of the maintaining relation with the allies, but and I think to some extent it's also almost universal. They're not so skillful in maintaining relations and even having a good soft power in terms of the let's say a lower level of the social strata, like the common people. Why? Probably historically they focus on the relation with allies in general. Secondly, I don't think their message it's well perceived and well obtained by the local people. Also, especially in case of the Africa, the problem is in some African countries that their presence in certain situation are related with some kind of a little bit controversial issues, either related with the labor law, or with the environmental concerns, and so on, so on. So quite often the Chinese presence in that way are perceived by the public opinion as a potential threat to the labor system, to the environmental situation, and so on, so on. So, for example, in Kenya, and what is interesting here, we investigated those both countries. We've been investigating. They are considered to be kind of the democratic. So there is a certain level of existing and working institutions like NGOs, free media, as well as the independent judicial system, which because those institutions are working, it ends up then in a certain way that some of the Chinese activities which were considered to be as a potential threat for local people, for the public opinion, have been stopped. For example, the good example is the coal power plant nearby the Lamu. Lamu is in the coastal area of the let's say north coastal Kenya. This is one of yes, first of all considered to be a UNESCO heritage, cultural heritage, as well as there's famous for this reef, coral reef, and so on, and the local community was threatened that they will lose actually not their potential source of income, because if you build a big coal power plant which is actually polluting, so then they managed to stop the project. So in that way, first of all, what is interesting here, we can see that the local public opinion is not so much pro-Chinese sometimes, and also in certain countries they are quite effective in stopping some of the Chinese activities, and that's a part which I think the Chinese still do not know how to cope with this, especially now, because I remember that around 2000, when I was in Kenya in 2016, so before this project started, there have been some looking almost like independent. They were not independent, but at least were looking like Chinese NGOs in Kenya. There were some young people there speaking quite well English, etc., etc. They could be perceived as a little bit like more, how to call it, normal Western NGOs. So I think they even started to establish a kind of I would say maybe not very relevant, but quite good relation with the local community. But then during the COVID and probably also related with the Xi Jinping general policy, all those more independent, let's say, examples of Chinese so-called NGOs activities have been stopped, and actually it has been centralized. So now we didn't see any of that kind of the activities, which are really which may be a little bit, I guess, successful working with the public opinion due to the centralization also process. And the last short remains, because sometimes there's a lot of discussion about the role of the Chinese diaspora in maintaining that kind of the network relations. Although in Kenya the Chinese diaspora is not so big, but although the diaspora in South Africa is quite big and significantly large, it doesn't fulfill the role as a kind of the middleman of building relations with China, mostly because of the fact that part of this diaspora is actually more related to Taiwan, not only from the mainland China. It's old one as well. So they're not necessarily supporting so strongly the Xi Jinping and Chinese Communist Party. And now technological cooperation. I would say I would focus on the two aspects here. First one, the Chinese role in the development of the digital technologies in Africa, and it's definitely quite significant. I would say that if you go to Africa, most of the mobile internet is provided by the Huawei or ZTE. Not necessarily because Africans love those companies, mostly because of the price, and that's common feature. They always say, it's like Chinese are just cheaper, and sometimes when we ask them what about the potential data protection, all those things related with the potential threats of obtaining the data from them, they said, yes, but we need to have something. If we have nothing, that's not working. And on the other hand, they also say sometimes that everybody is let's say taking the data if they can. Yeah, so something which, for example, in Poland was an issue, like the Huawei engagement in 5G technology. In Africa, nobody cares. Yeah, they need something. That's the most important issue, and it means that actually the Chinese not only build the whole system of the mobile internet access, but also they have a significant play a significant role in the e-trade, as well as for example the M-Pesa system. It's partly related with the cooperation with Huawei. The M-Pesa is kind of the system of the payment when they're using on the mobile phones. It doesn't even have to be smartphone. It can be like the old type phone. It's important for Africa because some of them they do not have smartphones. Yeah, so actually it's easier sometimes pays in M-Pesa than using any other method of payment. And Huawei is involved in this. They also managed to sell some surveillance system to some of the African countries, including actually South Africa and Kenya. But what is interesting here, because they're quite good in the facial recognition system, that probably you are quite aware about it. But what is interesting, and they're quite active to sell those products as well, even building smart cities, etc. So developing the technology they have. Also on the market where theoretically their technology or their products are not so considered to be not so suspicious, or at least those suspicions are not so important. So they managed to sell something, but we have to remember that not always those systems are working. So they implement, they build, and quite often then they are not working because there's not local maintenance support for the local maintenance, and local guys do not always care about maintaining the system working. So it's like sometimes it's even like a waste of money. But they're quite active in this area in Africa. Sometimes it can even bring a kind of the controversy to China. One of the well-known examples was related with the part of the process when they were preparing the facial recognition system for the Africans. So the problem was that the data they have from the other, like from China, didn't work in terms of the recognition of the African people. So they actually steal the data from Uganda, and there was a kind of a scandal, because I mean they take the data without asking of the permission. So there was a kind of the public discussion about it. And another issue which is important here is the emphasis put on theoretical emphasis put on I already mentioned that there is a strong emphasis put on the industrialization of Africa in the Chinese context, but the matter of the fact, although there are a lot of in the narratives, there's very little in the reality. They are, if we're talking about the bigger projects, there's a factory in Nigeria, Ethiopia shoes factory, which is actually helping to in terms of the providing some workplace, because they are quite strongly automatized. There is a kind of assembly plant for the cars in South Africa. That's more or less about the big projects. The rest, there are some small factories built or started by the local Chinese people, but they are not as significant. And in the matter of the fact, in general, we're talking about this last sentence about the sorry, I just got lost. Okay. Okay. Yeah, one sentence. There's too much. Okay, the whole discussion about the African investment, Chinese investment in Africa. The problem is that actually, there's very little of the real investments. Most of the issues which are mentioned in the narratives and are treated as an investment are, in the matter of the fact, infrastructure projects, which are actually backed by the Chinese loans, but they are not investments per se. So that's an important issue, because there's big discussion about the Chinese investment in Africa, but actually most of them are not investment per se. Okay, and I think that's all in case of for the Africa.
Now we're going to Central Europe.
Yeah, let's move to Central and Eastern Europe. Mario, if you can turn the slide. Thank you. So when it comes to narratives, we looked into narratives surrounding 16+1 format meetings. 16+1 is the China-led multilateral format in Central and Eastern Europe. Originally, it was 16 Central and Eastern European countries plus China. Then it was extended to 17, and now it's 14+1 because 3 Baltic states left in recent years. Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia decided to divorce with China in this multilateral body for a couple of reasons, including the Russian aggression against Ukraine and some strategic concerns related to China and its support to Russia. But anyway, when it comes to narratives, we need to remember that the last meaningful meeting of 16+1 took place only in 2021, because there is increasing interest in this initiative in Central and Eastern Europe for many reasons. So our study just stopped in 2021 when it comes to narratives. And if we can dig out some major themes in these narratives, first of all, it is traditional friendship, which is often emphasized by the Chinese policymakers for obvious reasons, because Central Eastern Europe was a part of the Soviet Union, or the part of the Soviet Union sphere of influence. They were communist countries, or socialist countries, so to speak. And this notion of shared post-socialist friendship is a major notion, and in fact a selection criteria for China to select the 16 countries, and to put them in the basket of China's relations with the developing world. However, I was pretty surprised when studying the narratives only in one document co-produced by China and Central Eastern European countries, because some of them are produced by the Chinese side, some by the European side. But anyway, the traditional friendship was inserted only once in such a document, which means that it doesn't really find a fertile ground in Central and Eastern Europe, these narratives. Unlike, for example, Taiwan, this is a sideline remark, because Taiwan is putting through this idea of shared experience in fighting authoritarian systems, the legacy of widely lived movement and Polish solidarity movement, etc., etc. So it's quite the opposite. China, what China wants to push through. The other accompanying themes when it comes to traditional friendship, like non-interference, socialism, are virtually absent from Chinese narratives, which again means that Chinese policymakers are aware that we don't really buy it. Secondly, when it comes to Chinese narratives, one of the main and repeatedly emphasized notion is Chinese economic development as a sort of opportunity for Central and Eastern Europe. And this notion of economic development and Chinese economic stability this is our interpretation, was in fact inserted in order to get some political enthusiasm among Central and Eastern Europe policymakers, because in a matter of fact, when the 16+ format was created in 2012, most of CE countries were really counting on China as a alternative source of money, technology, but it didn't really materialize these hopes. In fact, there is a strong sense of disillusionment across Central and Eastern Europe, because China just did not deliver when it comes to multilateral format, but also on the bilateral level. The only two countries that really get something from this cooperation are Serbia and Hungary, but for other reasons. For example, when it comes to Hungary, an important factor is German automakers. So there are some external factors behind the Chinese engagement in this country. In 2015, during summit in Suzhou, Xi Jinping literally said that Central and Eastern Europe belongs to China's Global South agenda, and this was the most explicit show that we are seen by the Chinese side. When it comes to successes, which are also repeatedly emphasized in the narratives, it's people-to-people ties, and this is where China is pretty strong, because all of these state-sanctioned people-to-people contacts like think tanks, forums, media cooperation, journalist forums, etc., are really aimed to create a critical mass of people in Central and Eastern Europe with an affinity towards China, right? With a positive thinking about China. And this, I think it slowly, it works, at least to some extent, because we have some other factors, external factors like war, security reasons, and etc. But at least for a time being, it was really effective. And according to Li Keqiang, so the former prime minister himself, he said that infrastructure for that people-to-people ties are infrastructure for developing state-to-state relations. And I think it explains a lot when it comes to Chinese logic behind developing people-to-people contacts. Trade is most critical. It is often emphasized in the narratives. A balanced trade based on WTO rules. However, in fact, for example, in Poland, we have the entirely different situation. Our deficit with China is like 1:13, like import-export ratio 1:13. So we import lots of products from China. We export. Our export is marginal, and this is the problem of the most of the C countries. Okay, let's move to network building. Okay, so when it comes to network building, I would like to once again refer to this reverse Orientalism, this notion of Central Eastern Europe as a less developed part of Europe, of the old continent. And for this reason, China uses lots of informal contacts, informal approaches towards political elites in China and in Central and Eastern Europe. This is also about cooptation, about elite capture, which is typical for Chinese activities in developing world. Some of the reasons may be the weak rule of law in many countries of Central and Eastern Europe. For example, in Czechia, there was a honeymoon between, for a couple of years, there was this very warm period between Czech elites, Czech politicians, and the Chinese policymakers. It is gone already. It's a history, but for several years, the informal contacts were very intense. Okay, so this image of this orientalized image of Central Eastern Europe translates to some extent into Chinese strategies towards the region. Some of them are successful. Some of these moves, especially in the Western Balkans. But anyway, what should be noted that 16+1 is decisively bilateral. So you create a multilateral umbrella in order to network among the states. It was never meant to construct any meaningful political entity or a format, so to speak. It was always about bilateral relations under multilateral umbrella. In Chinese narratives, it's called Shou Nao Wai Jiao, which means roughly a diplomacy of head of states, which translates into this notion of networkings among the politicians. And as I said, other functions of the format, including economics ones, are of secondary importance to China. Actually, we can name one or two truly multilateral projects. So for the format which exists since 2012, it doesn't really. I wouldn't call it a deliverable, a meaningful deliverable. Most of the projects are done through bilateral channels. And when it comes to our case studies under 16+1 Serbia, where one should note the principal role of the PRC embassy and party-to-party ties. There is strong consensus among the Serbian policymakers, no matter which party they represent, that Serbia should cooperate with China. There are economic reasons, but also political ones, or I would say ideological ones. The important point is Kosovo independence and lack of Chinese support to Kosovo. Secondly, 1999 NATO bombings on former Yugoslavia, and then some skeptical attitude towards democratic or liberal world order. In Poland, China had limited success in elite capture due to security considerations. Polish relations, Poland's relations with China are heavily securitized because of Russia, but also because of the US. For example, we had spying allegations for the Huawei employee in Poland. In 2019, there was a arrest of the Huawei employee. However, this is based mostly on some circumstantial evidence, and I don't believe it will find a proper solution in years to come. But it was around about the security of 5G networks, and many countries in Central and Eastern Europe were pushed by the US, not to cooperate with China in this matter. When it comes to technological cooperation, as I said, Poland is not a good example. However, Serbia is very actively cooperating with China when it comes to smart and safe city projects, including surveillance system, infrastructural projects, highways, Budapest Belgrade Railway, biotechnology, vaccines production during the COVID-19 pandemic, and military cooperation, which is pretty substantial given the Serbian position in the Western Balkans. China delivered the air defense systems to Serbia, military drones and other technological project which can develop Serbia's military capacities. And I think I will stop here. Yeah, Mario. Okay.
Well, the last part of today's conversation is Southeast Asia and conclusions, and I will try to be brief, as brief as possible. When it comes to narratives, what we as a team observed, of course, the Chinese leaders try to naturally navigate the narratives towards a cultural proximity. And this is, I think, important because China presents itself as peaceful civilization, harmony without uniformity, friendship and inclusiveness, but they say it's part of East Asian DNA, meaning that China is not out of the region. China is part of the region. So we belong together. And if you just go down to the China-Thailand relations, we are family. This is pretty nice. People would like to receive this message. Well, I'm family, but remember, in the Chinese language, you have Gege, Didi, and so on and so forth. So you have older brother and younger brother. So it should be taken with some consideration. The second issue is that the Chinese leaders really cherish the political wisdom of the past generations. So they portray the relationship with Southeast Asian countries as a continuity. However, at the same time, they're not referring to Maoist past. Because if you just remember, for example, the Cultural Revolution in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, in Thailand, etc., this is not what the audience would like to hear, right? Then the next point is about Chinese economy. And I think this is an interesting case because this only for us Southeast Asian audiences that they present the Chinese economy as a resilient. In the time of SARS and COVID-19, China was really powerful and China would like to cooperate in economic spheres with Southeast Asian nations. Then they also invoked the opinion of Justin Linifu. If you not know, it's a founding father of new structural economy. So this is also a big message towards Southeast Asian audiences that we are not only selling our political model, but we have an offer, and it's counter offer to the Western type of mentality of free market economy. That's new structural economy. That's at least my understanding here. And also during COVID pandemic, they said we not halt comprehensive reform or stop its pace of opening up. So they promised to be open, however, at the same time, they close the country. So we see this dichotomy between messaging and practices. Interestingly, in narratives also, they refer to digital cooperation as a part of poverty alleviation and pandemic management system. So they sell the digital technologies in order to secure selected countries from economic slowdown during the pandemic. When it comes to network building, and this is, I think, also very interesting when it comes to China's dealing with monarchies. Thai and Cambodia are monarchies, right? So definitely they're trying to find people from royal families. And like it or not, I mean, CCP is somehow the royal family in certain sense. But in case of Thailand, they mainly focus on Princess Shirinhorn and named her as old friend and good friend of Chinese people, not China, not the CCP, but Chinese people. So we have this people-to-people part, symbolizing China, Thailand as one family. She's a good example. And of course, she received the Friendship Medal. If you're interested, Mr. Putin also received Friendship Medal from Xi Jinping. So watch it on YouTube, and you have a feeling of how they manage their relationship with other leaders. However, when it comes to royal family, it's pretty difficult for them to find a relevant person to influence the domestic politics. It's not so easy. So they start with Huawei, and Huawei is pretty active on this front. So they support a lot of Princess Shirinhorn projects, particularly schools, medical treatment for students, etc. They're really also very active on the educational front. So what we also identified, the education sector in case of Thailand is pretty targeted by the Chinese diplomats. However, at the same time, they're facing a big issue because of unmature party system in Thailand. That's what we've learned from interviews in Thailand. On the other hand, we have Cambodia, that you have royal family and strong authoritarian tendencies by the government. So from this perspective, in case of Cambodia, they have two groups that they can really cultivate or capture. There's royal family, as you see. Also, Queen Mother is cultivated in a sense of giving. If you don't know, the royal family of Cambodia has a palace in Beijing. So they stay there for quite a long time, per year, but also they receive the health treatment in Beijing and so on and so forth. So this is how they really try to cultivate. On the other hand, when it comes to party-to-party relations, China is seen as a regional security provider. So this is win-win in case of China, Cambodia. However, recently we have some shifts in Cambodian and Laos politics. If you just see the changes in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of those countries, you will see that in the years to come, it might not be so easy for China to have a very close relations with at least Cambodia and Laos. They really did a lot from military to military relations, particularly during pandemic and facing diplomacy. However, of course, they need also to confront the realities on the ground. Chinese mafia in Chicanville, it's a thing. We don't know whether the Chinese Communist Party allowed the mafia, Chinese mafia, to launder money in Chicanville. However, what we were told, the money laundering activities by the Chinese citizens intensified since Xi Jinping launched anti-corruption campaign. So you have anti-corruption campaign, and then you have side effect in Cambodia. So from this perspective, it's also critical for us to understand this network building from the perspective I mentioned. Then tech cooperation, briefly, because we need to have a space for Q&A session. As I mentioned, this is something that China tried to sell in Southeast Asia. Huawei as a part of poverty alleviation and educational cooperation. So China is selling itself as a country that delivers. And if you remember, we've discussed the narratives at the multilateral formats. The history is a very little part of the conversation. China presents itself as a future. So this is something we need to understand. Because usually when you think about China, I mean, at least me, myself, a couple of years ago, I thought that China is a past, like they cherished Confucius, civilization, 5,000 years of history, etc. But it's not longer here. China presents itself as a future, and Europe and US is history. We the history, right? So this is also very important message. We have, of course, 5G mobile infrastructure, mobile internet speed, and improved digital connectivity. It's very general issues. However, when it comes to Cambodia, we see also the surveillance tools, including CCTV, facial recognition software, and internet firewall technologies. As I mentioned, in Cambodia, China is perceived as a regional security provider. So this is, I think, the key, plus military-to-military relations. Mario mentioned in Latin America pretty weak. However, if you just look into Cambodia's PLA presence, we see that they are really active and successful on this front, because they need Cambodia to manage a relationship in the China Peninsula. So I think this is relevant for us to make this kind of conversation about military to military in Southeast Asia. And just to conclude, I think we still have time, but from a narrative perspective, as you see here, we learned that at the multilateral platform, China CELAC, China ASEAN, China FOCAC, and China CE relations, China assigned specific roles to the various regions. Latin America is regional global, so both. Africa is global. If you just look into the Chinese narratives about relationship with Africa, United Nations and the global governance is very present there. When it comes to Central Europe, Bartek mentioned, it's purely on the bilateral level, and Southeast Asia is regional. So this is, I think, important when it comes to understanding China's presence in different multilateral platforms. Then, of course, when it comes to cultivation and relationship for various bilateral channels, we see that more or less we identify the major areas and China tried to cultivate relations. And as you see from this slide, we have Brazil, that is media and central local governments. This is very interesting case. Then in Chile, media, governmental elites, and parliamentary groups. In Kenya, that was mentioned by Jarek, is ruling elites and media also. South Africa, party-to-party, education, and ruling elites. In case of Serbia, you see ruling elites, party-to-party, but in Poland, this, building networks is truly limited because China is not well received because of Russia war in Ukraine, etc., etc. So only they try to appear in media. Then in case of Thailand, the educational sector mentioned, I think Confucius Institute, Hua Chao, not Hua Chao, but this Han Chao competition is pretty present. Chinese Bridge, plus royal family. In Cambodia, I just mentioned this a minute ago, party-to-party royal family, media plus military during COVID. And this is particularly critical if you just look into how China utilized pandemic to cultivate elites. They really did a lot in Cambodia about being present and have close relationship with military people. Then when it comes to, and its final slide, kind of debating the economy and the kind of economic statecraft, I think trade is number one. I think this is something that we should focus on because trade over dependency on China gonna influence our position vis-a-vis China. So market access for agricultural products, I think this is one of the issues that we focus in the project. That is, you see here, cherry, soya, avocado, and beef and poultry. So this is something that is important. Then free trade agreements, this whole negotiations about this part is important. Less important, Jarek also mentioned investment projects. You hear a lot about port infrastructure, lithium, SGR, of course, that's reality. But Lamu Port, Jarek mentioned also South Africa seaport infrastructure, Belgrade, Budapest, but it's only one single example of trilateral cooperation between China and two countries in Europe. So no multilateral projects.
Yeah,
China is mainly focusing on the bilateral issues. When it comes to tech, you have Chile with Huawei Cloud, sea cable, Mario mentioned, biometric passport, failure. Smart cities, also in Brazil, Kenya, M-Pesa payment, but it's joint venture with, I don't remember, one of the mobile provider from Europe. Also telecommunication, smart cities in Serbia and in South Africa, in Thailand, smart hospital. And I think that's part of the game when China can gain more attention from developing countries. China is providing digital, solutions for poverty alleviations and this stuff. And also, in case of Cambodia, the civil-military fusion should be really also focused. And I stop here. And, well, the floor is yours, I guess, Mario.
Well, we have 15 minutes. I know you're a little bit tired, and I can see from here. But nevertheless, we have 15 minutes, so I mean, the floor is yours. If you have any questions, you're free to raise them now. Otherwise, I really encourage you to raise questions because there's so many things, we would like to talk about, we haven't. So even if you don't raise questions, we are going to talk anyway. So. Okay, so go ahead.
I mean, for me, just I have a question, especially for Southeast Asia, because that's a region that I'm pretty familiar with. Just even if like there's reasons to actually pick Cambodia and Thailand, I'm actually curious about because one of the reasons that China would like push its politics onto other countries would be based on this idea of a shared like Chinese people idea. And also, for example, given that Indonesia or Malaysia have way higher, for example, population rates of Chinese people because of like Hokkien immigration and stuff. Why not pick those? Even like I understand the idea of not having so many policies, but for example, I'm like as long as I'm aware, Laos and Cambodia are really like really close with Chinese government. But I'm also curious about the relationship with like Malaysia and Indonesia. Why not pick those? And also with the changing of Indonesian government. But yeah.
This is always a dilemma, how to frame a research. And taken into consideration that we've decided back to 2019, when we prepared the proposal, to go with fragile state index, I mentioned at the beginning. So we took fragile country that was Myanmar at the beginning, but then due to the political reasons, we changed Myanmar to Cambodia, and Thailand. In a sense, it was more stable. I fully agree with you that Indonesia might be vis-a-vis Indo-Pak and so on and so forth. However, we try to focus on well, to a certain degree in the China Peninsula and try to understand the different dynamic between also neighboring countries. Because Thailand, Cambodia, the joint projects, of course, there is no Poland and Serbia, we don't have a border, but Brazil, Chile, and of course also Kenya and South Africa, they don't share common border, but still the basic rationale was to pick one fragile case and more stable, plus relations with the United States. If you just go back to the history of Southeast Asia, Thailand was one of the critical when it comes to Vietnam War. And the biggest embassy of the United States, a part of war zone in Baghdad, in Iraq, is in Bangkok. That's because of the historical past in the Vietnam War. So I can understand that Indonesia might be but then you have Muslim population, etc. But that's why we took.
And we cannot choose, more because it's already eight cases.
I mean, the case would be like to do every single region and make a study about every single country. But
So of course, both of them are relevant.
But I suggest here that if you think that it might be relevant for your research, so just try to compare different within the framework we propose in our project, that is narratives, networks, and economy. So that might be relevant. I mean, I'm not promoting the model in order to gain more citations from people in Spain. However, I think it might be relevant, Mario.
Yeah, I think something also interesting related to the question is the role of Chinese diasporas, because in some countries it's very sensitive issue. And actually, in Southeast Asia, it's super sensitive, and you have a very long history, right, of intercommunal violence, actually, But when it comes, for example, to Chile and Brazil, it's not that sensitive, So even if those communities, they don't have the same kind of influence that they have in Southeast Asian countries, partly because they don't have that kind of influence. It's easier to use them, for Chinese diplomacy, to promote, narratives and activities and so on and so forth. So that's also, an interesting dimension, right, of this project that we haven't elaborated much, today. So yeah, if someone, has questions and is shy to present them because of the language, you can raise the question in Spanish, and that's not worry.
I had a question more about the Western Balkan part. You said that there was a decrease in interest from China and from the Western Balkan countries. And I would like to know how it affects infrastructural projects in this area.
Actually, maybe it's a misunderstanding. I was implying that there's decreasing interest in cooperating with China generally across the Central Eastern Europe, but Western Balkans is the exception. It's continuously warm, the cooperation and relations are pretty good, and Serbia is, of course, number one friend in the Western Balkans, or maybe in Europe in general. There are lots of infrastructure projects, but not only railway, but also highways. For the country which was destroyed by the war, it's essential to have some external funds for such projects. But the thing is that along these projects, there is an ongoing elite capture. So the political influence of China is increasing through these projects and by these projects. You probably heard that last month there was a tragedy in Novi Sad, the train station collapse and part of the train station. And at least political opposition was accusing the ruling party for taking bribes, for being corrupt, and to inflate the cost of the projects and the quality of the projects. And so this is how things are going on in the Balkans with China. So maybe it was a misunderstanding. Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, I just want to add one issue here. One of the because while we are thinking about this, we didn't mention today, but in general we have discussion about it. That we also investigated certain areas or certain factors which may make particular country more, let's say, prone to being under Chinese influence in different ways. So, for example, like if we compare Poland and Western Balkans, Poland is a part of the EU, which means that we have the whole idea of developing our infrastructure using EU funds, etc., etc., etc. And in case of the Western Balkans, they are outside of the EU, so they need money for the infrastructure. That's why I'm more prone to take those projects as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Although we tend to overemphasize the importance of China, even in the Western Balkans, because still the principal source of investment is the EU countries. Politically speaking, it's also the EU, etc., etc. So China is making a lot of noise, but when it comes to deliverables, to delivering projects, it's not that strong, as we tend to see China, to imagine China.
I think that this is very relevant for us to to recognize narratives, slogans, and propaganda from the realities. And what we're trying also to do in this project is, on the one hand, we're following narratives. We see how China tried to flame enthusiasm among leaders across developing countries. But on the other hand, we see a lot of projects that are not delivered.
We see that Latin America is in the point where Central and Eastern Europe was 10 years ago. There's still political enthusiasm, right?
Yeah.
That's for
Yeah.
Well, but I think it's a huge difference because when we talk about regions, we lose the granularity. The detail of the case
That's
study,
true.
and this is key because every country is different. For example, but I think that the key idea, maybe if we have to summarize, is that China is very attractive for diversification. Most of the countries, most of the regions, they want to diversify because most of their engagement is the traditional powers. So even if China is not delivering as much as they expected, at least delivering something. And there are some particular cases. In our case, in our research project, Brazil and Chile actually, are particularly salient on that, where the trade relationship is hugely significant. And that trade relationship, for example, with Brazil and Chile, is very focused on the primary sector. We mentioned the agro-food, but also, minerals, the mining. And this has huge implications, But when it comes to investment, when it comes to financing, generally speaking, the data is not as significant as people think. But at least, it's some kind of diversification. And just from my perspective, last thought on my side, is that political engagement, even if some of the economic dimensions are not as significant as people think or as expected, but because China, as you know, is a party-state country, and there is no independent economic power in China. The political elites, always can have this influence. So political engagement always have this economic dimension. Maybe it does not deliver that much, but at least can deliver something, I think that's also the reason Latin American or African or Southeast Asian political elites, they value this diplomatic engagement with Chinese authorities because it can provide, at the socioeconomic front.
And this is particularly relevant when debating China's domestic transformation. China is still a trade nation. In a sense, the Chinese economic development is still based on export. So what we also identified over the years of the BRI, the overdependency on China's market, in particular in Chile and Brazil, is pretty significant. Now, China is of 38% partner in Chile, trade partner in Chile. So
for export, yeah.
Yeah,
Chile
for export.
Yeah.
And then Brazil, 26%. So this is something that we need to observe, this trade over dependency in China's relations with the global south. Investments and other stuff, maybe technical cooperation might be also here important, but still trade is dominated by China's activities in developing countries due to undone reforms inside China. Because still this mentality of export-led economy, not economy driven by domestic consumption, is pretty relevant when it comes to China's economic diplomacy in the developing countries.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, we can finish here. Okay, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, Mario.
Thank you too. We will see each other soon.